Welcome to Scigest, your fortnightly serving of digestible science from plant and food research.
Hello and welcome to a new edition and a new series of Scigest called Science Movers and Shakers. In this series, we'll be talking to science leaders and science influencers right here in New Zealand. First up in the hot seat is someone who has the ear of the most powerful person in New Zealand. Not the actual ear, that would be weird and scary. Today we're talking with the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor, Professor Juliet Gerrard. And to help ask the hard questions today, I've dragged kicking and screaming from the lab, Blue Plunkett.
Hello, Andrew.
And Jessica Rodriguez.
Kia ora.
Firstly, kia ora, Juliet. Thanks for joining us today.
Kia ora.
Chief Science Advisor sounds like a great thing to put on a business card, but many people might not know much about the role. What is the main role of the Chief Science Advisor in New Zealand?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I asked the same one when I was first approached about the job. So it's in the title. I advise the Prime Minister, but what people probably don't realise is that I also talk to various other ministers and ministry officials all around Wellington, trying to work out where research can best influence policy.
Okay, so on an average day, what would an average day be like? Just to ring you at 6 a.m. on a special hotline or a bat phone, or is it a little bit less dramatic than that?
I do have a bat phone, but it doesn't ring very often.
Okay.
It rang yesterday, but it was a wrong number.
Disappointing.
But she does ring me occasionally if she wants some advice, just quickly and verbally on something that's maybe an issue in the media or something that needs translating. Maybe two scientists are arguing and she wants a sort of balanced take on it, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Or maybe it's just some quick policy advice where there's not enough time to prepare a formal paper.
So you often have to give opinions on the fly, or do you go away and consult?
No, normally get some warning. So one of the
Okay.
things I've been trying to do is pull a team of science advisors together. So there's lots of science advisors embedded now in ministries, and it's good to draw on their expertise as well and other experts. So I'm slowly, my cell phone's filling up with numbers of scientists who I might need to call in a hurry.
Okay. So
But that's not an average day. That would be an unusual day. Usually the work program's more structured than that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So your predecessor was quite a prominent scientist, Sir Peter Gluckman. Did he have any advice for you before you started the job, or did he just say, here it is?
He had lots of advice. That's the thing about advisors. They do a lot of advising.
They're good at advising. Yeah.
So he was really generous with his time and sat down and gave me as much information as he could. I took a notebook. I needed a few.
Yeah. And were there some important lessons from his time as Chief Science Advisor that you're going to take on board and use in your role?
Yeah, I think probably the most important one was to stick to the evidence. So it's likely that some of the scientific evidence will be politicised, but that's not the science advisor's job. It's to present the evidence in as non-partisan a way as possible and really put it in context.
So you can't be an advocate. You've got to be very neutral and stay true
as
to
neutral as possible.
Yeah, sure. When he stepped down from the role, I seem to remember he threw a bit of a political hand grenade about New Zealand adopting gene editing technologies. Did that make for a sort of a rough start to your new job, or?
Certainly made for an interesting start. And he did, I think, to be fair to Peter, he gave a very long interview and that soundbite was taken out and made into a headline. So he came up with the headline, GE is safe. And that's not actually what he said. It was a much more measured statement. But it did make for a few interesting conversations in the first week.
Yeah.
And he did email and apologise for leaving me with that. And I gather Peter Gluckman apologies are very rare, so I treasure that.
Have it written down, monogrammed on a piece of paper or something.
Yeah.
I guess that's the danger of the role, is that the media get a hold of comments and they will inflate them to make a headline, so to take the front page the next day.
Yeah, so I'm learning that anything I say can be tweeted out of context. So if I'm in a room, I might get asked to provoke the audience and start a debate, but the most provocative comment will be the thing that gets tweeted out of context. So I have to be a bit more cautious than I used to be in the old days.
Yeah, a little bit less fun, I guess. Science and politicians, they're kind of worlds apart, I'm guessing. It must be quite a transition from working in a science role or managing scientists or leading science to working with and advising politicians.
Definitely. So that's been the steep part of the learning curve. So I had a little bit of interaction with government before when I was chair of the Marsden Fund. So I reported mainly to Stephen Joyce during the time I happened to be doing it. But the breadth of the role and working out how the beehive works and the difference between the politicians, the advisors and the officials, all those subtle, nuanced relationships has taken a while to get my head around.
Yeah, I guess the the personalities and the way they deal with information must be very different to the way scientists deal with information and process it.
Yeah, but I guess politicians are probably more representative of the general public than scientists are. So you actually get a really good understanding of some of the science communication principles that you've learned in action, because it's not a particularly expert audience, but obviously a very powerful audience.
Yeah.
It's how to put the information so it's accessible to them.
Okay. You've already kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but people say scientists know more and more about less and less as they advance through their careers. We become more specialised. So how do you advise on issues that are kind of way outside your areas of expertise? I guess you can't be an expert on everything.
That's been the biggest challenge, I think. So setting one person up as the guru on all topics, I don't think is a very good model. It's not a sustainable model. So I've been trying to build little communities of expertise around hot topics. So, for example, around climate change, I've been calling or visiting all the opinion leaders and experts in New Zealand. It's a small country, so there aren't that many. So everyone that's been commenting in the paper or publishing high-profile papers or involved with the IPCC, and just had a chat. What do you think the key issues are? So obviously I've done a lot of reading myself, but just sense check that with them and then open the door so that they feel completely comfortable calling me if there's an issue that they think I should raise.
Right.
Or I can just check in with them if there's something where there's a bit of a debate and I want to sense check what we're saying.
Okay, so you've got to have quite a collaborative environment.
I did want to ask a little further about your comment that, I guess, having one person be the voice of experts when you might not necessarily be an expert in all individual subjects, because it sounded like before there was a Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor, there were several Chief Science Advisors that reported directly to the ministries. And several other countries, like Germany, for example, still have that sort of more, a body of scientists advising rather than one person then that has, as Andrew put it, the ear of the most influential person in New Zealand. But there are benefits to, I guess, there being one head to represent the body. So what do you think those might be?
So I think we actually have a lot more science advice going in independently than people have been aware of. So Peter Gluckman was the first person to hold a role, and I think it was a bit of an experiment. It was only a 0.3 position, and he grew it and really made the case that government needed to be listening to evidence across all subjects. It goes all the way to justice. It's not just what people would classically think of as science. And so he really made strong cases in individual ministries to appoint those people. And they don't report to me. They didn't report to him. They report into the ministries. But there is that community of practice so that we can share information. So they got into the habit of meeting quite informally. I've made it a little bit more formal and a little bit more high profile. So, for example, Ian Lambie is the Chief Science Advisor to Justice, and he released that report. It came out through my office, but he fronted that. So the team's getting a bit more profile because he's the expert in justice, I'm not. And I wrote the foreword. So I think one person to funnel that information up is good, but we need ways to build that team and better connect the researchers with the advisors.
And speaking of building teams, I guess a lot of the issues that we're facing are international issues, for example, global warming. So do you also have to develop links with overseas experts and advisors?
Yes. So again, thanks to Peter, New Zealand's very well connected to international science advisors. So I've already visited the APEC Chief Science Advisors and Equivalence meeting, which was in Brisbane last year, and the INCSA meeting, the International Network of Government Science Advice, that Peter actually chaired in Tokyo. And I'm in touch electronically with the British Canadian advisors so far. So certainly if there's a global issue, then there's definitely a community of people out there to draw on. No point us all reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, there's lots of support there for you there. You started out doing a national tour asking scientists what they thought the key issues were. I'm sitting here looking at a wall covered, absolutely plastered with pink and blue post-it notes. Was there any commonality in the themes, or was it just a really diverse range of responses that people want to talk about?
So the commonality is striking, I thought. So I've clustered them around the big headings. So lots of people had common issues. And one of the nice things was whether I was talking to a bunch of engineers or a bunch of medics or social scientists, lots of the issues were the same. So the question I asked was, where is there an evidence base from research that could inform policy? It's not like what's the most important issue, but where could we really make a difference? And a few issues sang out, so you can have a look at those on the website, or you're looking at them behind me. And the one that came out as top of the list was something on plastic. plastics. So I've called it Alternative to Plastics. We've actually just started that piece of work. So the panel met last week. We're calling it Rethinking Plastics in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Okay.
Multidisciplinary panel, and it's very open to input from all sectors. We've got business on there and international connections on there. So really looking forward to getting that going.
And that's an issue that's really starting to come to light now in the media, and I guess there's alternatives out there that we should be looking at, and science has got a big role to play in.
It is. So my post-its and biscuit tin method matched the Colmar Brunton poll that's coming out tonight, which picks plastics as the top issue for New Zealand. So
Okay, and their poll probably cost a lot more than yours. You just had a couple of packs of Post-it notes,
I
I
should
guess.
ring them up, shouldn't I?
Yeah.
Yes, so you brought up alternatives to plastic, and I guess before we go specifically into policy, it intrigued me that I guess your experience as a biochemist was in a ways, thinking of how to design materials. So do you think you have a unique perspective, having been in that sort of research position, then to advise in this capacity?
Yeah, it does give me one lens into it. So I've been involved in the Science for Technological Innovation Challenge, which is focused on new materials, but also on that connection with business. So I think this is a topic where an ivory tower report won't be much use. There's lots of work already done internationally, and what we really need to know is how to make it work in New Zealand. So yeah, but all those frames probably with it.
So you already mentioned previously that interacting with, I guess, different cross-sections of the community is very important to your role. And you talked a little bit with Andrew about your interaction with government policymakers. So I guess so far, what has been your experience of how they've utilized your expertise and that of your team, since you mentioned that your team is really the heart and soul of your advising capability?
Yes, so there's two teams, I guess. There's the three people in the office here. They're working pretty hard. And then there's the team of science advisors, and how they're used depends on their local context. So it depends on the size of the agency or the ministry. How I'm used depends on the question of the day and who I'm interacting with. So,
okay, I guess would it be breaching into confidentiality to ask you for examples of things that you've advised on?
in some places it would definitely breach confidentiality, but around the greenhouse gases, certainly I've had informal conversations with people from Ministry for the Environment, people in the Beehive at all levels. So that's very topical at the moment, and the sort of thing where I would get involved in a conversation. Another one that I can share might be communication of risk. So there's quite a lot of science on how you communicate risk and how you make the public mindful but not anxious. Mm-hmm. So that's an area I get involved in behind the scenes. Yeah.
Was it helpful for you to maybe review the way Peter Gluckman had dealt with episodes in the past and I guess his style of communication and setting up information for policymakers to review?
Yes, so we're very different people. And that was one of the things we reflected on during the handover. But I think actually it sends quite a strong message that two very different people with very different communication styles have the same baseline take-home message, which is we need to look at the evidence. Mm-hmm. And so I think that our differences are around style rather than substance. And I certainly have a much more informal style than Peter. I probably have broader conversations and I bring more people around the table than he tended to. But the important thing is that we were both focused on the evidence base.
It seemed also, I guess, going back to Peter Gluckman's term, that there were times when the government didn't always like what he had to say. So have you had that feeling at any stage of your role so far? And if you do have that in the future, how do you hope to deal with that?
The role's independent, and so it's actually important that you're not seen as working for the government. We're here to advise the government. So I'm still fully employed by the University of Auckland and seconded into the role. So if I did need to speak out against government policy, and this was something that was probed in some depth in my interview, the correct response in this role would be to speak out. You might have to resign afterwards, but I can still pay my mortgage because the University of Auckland's paying me, not the government. So there's that one step removed that gives you some independence. And the other thing to remember, and Peter was very strong on this point, is that the scientific evidence is only one line of thinking, and not everyone in New Zealand thinks that we should just decide according to the scientific evidence. It might be that there's other factors around people's values and priorities that mean that it's just not practical to go into policy. So one of the ways that I've tried to prioritise is where we can make a difference, and there is this appetite. So plastics is something where people really want some solutions, and so let's use that as a vehicle to show that we can bring the evidence together and make change.
Are plastics your primary focus at the moment, and then would you move on to other areas after you feel like you've gotten a good solution down for plastics?
Yes, so all these topics that you're looking at on the post-its behind me, the big headings are up on the web, and I'm in the process of prioritising those with the PM. So we meet every few weeks and sit down and say, all right, what's next? So plastics was first. We haven't decided what the next one is yet. The plastics will take us a while. And the other thing I'm doing in the background is smaller bits of work, just putting together information sheets on hot topics. So antimicrobial resistance is up there, and that's something where we put out just 2 pages of information. We didn't really need to do a big project on it because that had been done internationally. We just needed to explain really clearly what all the experts think in New Zealand and what the international work means for this country.
So I don't know if you guys might have seen, but I saw a paper about a month ago where someone in Japan had discovered some bacteria breaking down the plastics with a new enzyme.
Yeah.
I don't know if you'd seen that, and if you think that might be a sort of approach that could be feasible.
I'd love it to be, because I'm an enzymologist by training. Whether that's practical and whether we can implement it as a solution is one of the things we're going to look at. So I think the plastics report will make recommendations along 3 horizons. It'll be quick things we can all do right now, businesses, individuals, government. Medium-term solutions like better recycling and incorporation of materials into roads, things like that. And then Horizon 3 type solutions where we're looking for new materials, new ways of getting rid of existing materials.
Right, yeah, Horizon 3, I like that term. I'll remember that one.
You mentioned that as an enzymologist, you would love for it to be true. So I guess there is that sense that you realize that you're coming from a particular perspective and that you're actively trying to not let that cloud your official statements. On your website as well, you mentioned that inclusivity is one of the 4 principles you're striving to work towards. So could you elaborate a little more on that?
Yeah, so those 4 principles that I've used to frame the work programme are rigorous, transparent, accessible and inclusive. I think, as you mentioned before, the first 3 are probably self-evident. But inclusive, I took the 4 principles from a Nature paper that was published just before I started. And they didn't elaborate much on inclusive in that paper, but one of the things that they really focused on was it must be inclusive of the policymakers. So there's no point advising in a room where the policymakers aren't sitting, because how are you going to implement your advice? And so it's important to get everyone around the table. But I think, especially in New Zealand at the moment, we need to broaden that. So inclusive to me means 2 things. One is who's doing the work, and we've got a lot of work to do in terms of making sure women are represented at all levels in science. We're doing pretty well compared to where they were 25 years ago, but could do better. And also that we broaden that to look at other forms of diversity, and in particular Maori and Pacifica. I think the MB diversity statement quotes 2% participation against a population base, which should be something like 20-25, depending on how you count. So we've got a lot of work to do there. And the other thing we need to do is think about how the questions are framed. So just by scoping out a piece of research or a piece of advice, you exclude certain worldviews. So broadening the context in which we give science advice, I think, is important.
Great, and I noticed that cultural context was one of the themes on your wall, so it's actually great that there's that overlap between what you'd planned to do and then the voice of the people telling you what their hopes for your influence would be.
Yeah, hopefully. So I'm trying to listen to as many people as possible while still getting some things done. So there's a balance there. But I think the plastics project is a nice topic in that it brings in lots of principles. So, for example, the Te Ao Māori concept of kaitiakitanga, guardianship of the environment, that's a really obvious theme to frame the plastics work around, because we're not doing a very good job at looking after the planet. So that's something that everyone can resonate with, that's much more inclusive than a more scientific framing, perhaps.
Yeah, that sounds really good, how bringing in different worldviews into the idea to sort of feed into how science might influence all of that is quite a hard path to negotiate, I imagine, but it's cool to see that starting to form. And I was interested in around how within that there's kind of been a narrative recently perhaps of a little bit of mistrust around science, at least from what I've seen in the media. I was wondering if you sort of got a feel for that in your tour around the country, or is there a bit of mistrust in science at all, do you think?
Mostly I was talking to scientists, so the thing I focused on was getting them to ask that question, and it was quite a high priority topic as I travelled. people are starting to say, you know what, we've got some work to do here to earn that trust. There's not any recent figures, I don't think, in New Zealand about whether people trust scientists. There's some in Australia. For the most part, most people trust science. But if you look what's happening in the States, I saw a frightening podcast over the weekend on flat earthers, and the number of people that believe the earth is flat is growing in America. So those international trends, I don't think we can assume we're going to avoid them.
Yeah, some of those conspiracy theories are quite curious to watch develop.
I actually had a question about that. Do you think it's just that the polls that measure the percentage of flat earthers are just getting accessibility to more people with social media and the internet now than perhaps traditionally they would have? So it might not be that mistrust in science is increasing. It's just that it has a much wider audience now and can be disseminated more easily. And so it's just being heard in a way it wasn't before.
Maybe. There was a convention for them all, so they all gathered and had some fascinating theories. So it's hard to know because you haven't got that baseline data, but it's certainly worth making sure that we listen to those people and see where those views are coming from and try and work out how to better communicate what we're trying to do with the evidence. Yeah.
I saw a guy interviewed who was a flat earther, and they asked him, are there a lot of you around? He said, yeah, we're all around the world.
Yeah. Think about the
interview, and I
sentence.
did a slight double take, and yeah, it's great.
I think one of them was talking about gravity not existing and explaining with a new force called dropity.
Dropity.
Yeah.
Okay, I hope that's going to be
Arose by any other name?
physics syllabus next year. Dropity. Kids, look out for it.
No, I can understand a little bit, though, because sometimes the words we use really reflect, I guess, our cultural context. And I can see how sometimes people who, might want to challenge the existing cultural context might want to rephrase things or just, expose alternative methods of thinking. Not necessarily that they believe that they're better, but just feeling that things are too rigid the way they are.
Yeah, it's kind of understandable that it's happening, I guess. It's just how to counteract that with this sort of evidence base that there is an interesting interplay. And so do you think that perhaps the responsibility of scientists around communicating that type of thing needs some work? Is it a communication problem from the scientists, perhaps?
I think maybe it's a listening problem. So I think science has had huge privilege for the last, 100 or so years, where we became the experts and plotted graphs and waved fingers, and now information's so much more accessible to way more people, and so we can't pull rank. We need to listen to communities and say, what problem are we trying to solve and how can we help you solve it, or what opportunities can we create and how can we help you create it, rather than distance ourselves from communities, I think.
Right, and do you think that social media has an important role that sort of science should pick up a bit more? I know a part of your focus has been starting to use Twitter and things to try and engage more with the public. So how have you found Twitter, and beyond that, do you think there's other avenues for using social media in that regard?
I think there's huge potential. So Peter was a very active Twitterer. I inherited his official feed. I've used it in a slightly different way. I've tried to be more interactive and less formal, probably. It's hard to know if you're successful on social media because you just live in your little echo chamber of sciencey people. So breaking out of that is a challenge. I also started an Instagram account to try and celebrate New Zealand science a bit more and how beautiful some of the images are. So it's been great. People have been sending me images. I hope they keep sending me them. And just engage a different crowd. But again, how do you know who you're talking to? So if more people did it, and more people did it in a way that reached out beyond just science, I think there's huge potential. But
yeah, I like the listen more idea. I hadn't considered that before, and it makes sense immediately, so that's quite cool. And so using Twitter and things, have you found that you've had to modify your communication style, perhaps less sort of scientific and technical, but is there anything else you've had to sort of adapt to, like become more general or things like that to interact in that kind of way?
yes, I'm trying to think of an example. Probably the very first thing I tweeted from that account was those 4 principles, because I thought that would be a nice way to kind of frame what I was going to do. And I was challenged immediately by Māori researchers saying, the whole process of evidence synthesis is not inclusive of kaupapa Māori research methods. And I'm not an expert on kaupapa Māori research methods, but I've talked to a lot of those people since. And the basic problem is that lived experience is hard to present as evidence. So you might be really sure within your community context that certain things work, say might help kids, but you haven't done a controlled experiment by removing that resource from half the kids to make sure that they suffer. It's a different sort of evidence, and how you take that lived experience and present it as evidence is a real challenge. So that was an example of, I thought, putting inclusive down was very obvious to me would be inclusive of everybody, and there was a whole body of research out there that said, no, actually, your idea of inclusive is not inclusive. And so I went to Waikato and listened to those researchers. Leonie Pihama was the one who organised a fantastic group of people for me to just really hear that perspective and see what we could do. So that's a good example of where, as a biochemist, I hadn't really thought about lived experience as evidence, but it's a really valid argument, and one that if we could bring it into the evidence base would add real strength.
You also brought up, I guess, the theme of raising children and about how it's really an experiment that you don't really want to do in a clinical setting. And so, being a young mom myself, I can see with my own experience that it's sort of definitely changed the way I think, the way I interact with other people, the way I view things that occur in society. And I wonder if you felt the same, a point to be made that it's a bigger disadvantage in the working world to be a mother than to be a woman. So I think that, the fact that you've achieved as much as you have and have had 2 children that you obviously have great relationships with. I read somewhere that your daughter was your unofficial social media guru when you first started the job.
Yeah.
So,
Stop over posting, Mum. Good feedback.
Yeah, no, and so it's great, I guess, that you've been able to incorporate both areas of your life in a I guess, a beneficial way. So I was just wondering if you could share more on what your experiences have been as a mum and a woman in science, and whether you think that benefits your current role.
Yes, so I think you're right about being a mother being harder than being female. So I discovered feminism when I had kids, partly because I was on maternity leave and I had time to read, but also because people treated me very differently. That was the first time I felt a gendered response. And people would say, shouldn't you be home with your kids? In a very benign and supportive way, but it was also slightly undermining. I found it really helpful because if you can deal with 2 toddlers, you can deal with an academic staff meeting. It's the same sort of thing. So you can't say go to your room.
Maybe a few less nappy changes, but
not really.
Hopefully a few less
okay.
So I always found that the 2 fed off each other really, and also I've never met a working mum that isn't super efficient. So I think people get a lot more efficient when they have kids. I think lots of that's true of dads too. And I keep saying it'll be great when a woman gets a job like this and doesn't get asked this question, or when a guy gets asked, how do you combine fatherhood with your career? But we're not there yet.
Well, what are your views, I guess, as someone who's striving to bring more evidence into policy on, basic gender differences? Anatomically, our brains are different. Going through parenthood, we have different hormonal responses that affect how we emotionally interact with the world around us. And how do you think all that should or, shouldn't feed into workplace views? Yeah,
that's a tricky one. I'm thinking about that recent Mike Hosking I'm going to say outburst about the Global Women report that said that we didn't have enough women on boards. So a lot of those traditional views of what women bring to the workplace were expressed quite strongly in that. I think we have to be really careful because on average women might be a certain way doesn't mean any particular woman is. And I think the place the evidence base is best used is around diversity. So I think it's pretty incontrovertible that if you have different views around the table, not just gender, but from any lens you look at, you get better decisions. And so that's the bit that I think is important to keep saying. So I was on your board for a while as the only woman around the table on either the board or the senior management team, because we lost one board member and she didn't get replaced immediately. So the last few months I was literally the only woman in the room talking about diversity. And it's really hard to argue against the fact that you would get a better starting point of ideas on the table if you had more diverse people around the table.
Yep, no, and I think it's, I don't know if that was advice you gave to our board, but our board definitely has more women, more culturally diverse now, and we've had 2 recent science group leader openings, and this is, I guess, a shameless plug for plant and food research, and both of them have been filled by young women who are mothers of children under the age of 5. So I was very proud as a woman to see that happening in my workplace. Of course, I sort of, in the back of my mind, do think about what the long-term effects of this are on community structure. That, I guess if traditionally women have been, more going to the PTA meetings, being that social glue between different families, then to have women be in the workplace, also have women, look after household affairs, that's somehow taking away more from that community building role. And I wonder what the long-term effects of that will be, but
hopefully the men are at the PTA meeting.
Yeah. So, I think that's something that's great to kind of push, is that now that we've achieved a certain amount of recognition for women, to also say, all right, now we need to promote men taking on increased roles in the community and in their family life and parenting and other things.
Yeah, if they want to. And again, nobody's trying to make a formula, but on average, you'd expect more men to want to do that than maybe do. Yeah. And I've been back and visited the board for a dinner. And I helped hire those two women. So very different mood around the dinner table than the one I left, which was great. Yeah.
It sounds like you see the situation of gender equity and equality improving in New Zealand. Do you think that it still has a long ways to go?
Depends how you measure. So I had a conversation with the chair of a board, I won't say which one, a couple of weeks ago, and he claimed that it was getting very hard for men in science to get senior roles because everyone was so conscious of needing to hire women. And he cited as evidence the fact that I'm a woman, Megan Woods is a woman, the president of the Royal Society is Wendy Lana, she's a woman, and you could go Chief Justice, Prime Minister, Governor General. I took it as a sign of progress that he was feeling disempowered. I'm not sure he's completely correct because it doesn't trickle down. So if you look at all the layers in an organisation, there's often a winner at the top, if you call women in that position a win. But it's not there, so the layers aren't coming through. So I think we've got a long way to go, but we've made a lot of progress. But I'd rather start looking at other demographics too. Where are the Māori leaders in science?
Which kind of brings me quite nicely to the next little mini topic I've got. I guess in New Zealand, we've got underrepresentation of Maori and Pacifica. I mean, without having your chief science advisor hat on, do you have any ideas about how we can, obviously no silver bullets, but how we can improve the participation rates of these groups?
That's one of the things I've been looking at, and MB are working on it too, so we've been talking to them. It's hard, so I can go to an undergraduate audience and encourage the women, but there's not enough Māori scientists there to encourage. There's a few, but not enough, not representative. So I think we have to go right back to schools. And there's some great programs out there. So there's this one run out of Massey, but not just for Massey, called the Pahuro STEM program. And they've been just going into classes and pulling out the Māori kids and putting them in a group so that they can bond, have extra tuition, just chat. And it's all about seeing people like yourselves, right? So they're not the only kid in the class that looks like that. And I went and talked on a marae, and a really interesting combination of the two worldviews. So they absolutely want to make a contribution in science, but retain their cultural context.
And I guess our worldview is so deeply ingrained from years of study at university and the Western view of science.
Yep.
I was talking at a school and I was talking about driving down to Wellington for something. And a Māori kid said to me, no, you don't drive down to Wellington, you drive up to Wellington. And I'm like, how does that work? And he explained to me, it's the head of the fish. Northland is the tail of the fish. You drive up to the head of the fish. You don't drive down to the head. So it's like, it really shook me because I find it really hard to, flip my worldview around to accommodate that. But it's just as valid as, I guess, as the thing that I've been brought up with.
Totally arbitrary, right? So some of those things, yeah.
And it does make you question it, I guess.
It does, and it comes back to that inclusivity thing. So if you were to say up, that person would feel more included.
Yeah, and it's such a small thing, but it's just making that adjustment in your own head. So thinking big picture and thinking future, is New Zealand science kind of heading in the right direction, do you think? Are we on the right track?
Well, that's a good question. I think we really need to work on the social license piece. So that's my number one priority, is to persuade scientists that they need to get the public behind them.
So fair to say we haven't been listening very well, or been a bit arrogant maybe? And
we've probably listened as well as any scientist anywhere in the world, but we've got an opportunity to do a lot better. And our particular cultural context gives us, I think, some really nice tools to do that.
Yeah.
So lots of the solutions that I was looking for around social license issues on tricky topics like 1080 and genetic modification, where people are really locked into battle, lots of those communication tools exist in the Māori world already. Just getting everybody's views around the table, having a big hui, talking about it at the beginning, not the end, all those kind of ways of interacting, I think we can really learn from what happens on a marae, for example, to try and progress those conversations.
Yeah, so we're taking steps, but they're kind of shaky steps at this stage. I guess it's early days.
Yes, there's some great people doing some great work, but it needs to spread.
Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today. Juliet, thanks for sharing with us your experiences.
Thank you. Ka pai.
Hopefully this role will lead to some smart science-based policy decisions being made at all levels in the country. And we'd like to thank our listeners for listening, and please sure to post a review and to subscribe to scigest on iTunes. Ka kite anō. Goodbye, see you later.